Just a quick little point to make about longswords. Hey folks, Matt Easton here, scholagladiatoria. So here I have a longsword, or I would call this more of a bastard sword. It's a subjective definition. Bastard sword, longsword essentially mean the same thing, but this is the Albion mercenary, and this is actually quite a handy sword in one hand. It's not very long. The blade's not really longer than a one-handed sword. It just has a longer handle. That's my personal definition of a bastard sword, that it's really kind of like a one-handed sword with an elongated handle, whereas to me a longsword is longer in the blade as well as longer in the handle. But the point I want to make really is, so 2 points actually, I'm going to cheat. It's 2 points. Firstly, to say, a lot of people who aren't necessarily that interested in history but quite think swords are quite cool, think that long swords were very prevalent in the medieval period, and perhaps even some people think they were the standard medieval European sword. They weren't. So the first thing to say about longswords is I personally believe that at no point, in no place, that is in no area of Europe, and at no point in the Middle Ages, were longswords ever the most common swords. They were popular. They enjoyed a degree of popularity, particularly amongst certain people. Now, I'm not going to be too categorical about which groups of people, because they varied in different places. For example, we know that the longsword was particularly popular in the end of the 14th century, beginning of the 15th century in England amongst the gentry, that is knights, the knightly classes. But equally, we know that the longsword was very popular in Switzerland and Burgundy in the middle of the 15th century amongst quite common people, common soldiers, and professional soldiers, people like professional archers, Swiss pikemen, this type of thing. We know that longswords were popular amongst them as well. Equally, we know that in Germany in the 15th century, famously so, leading to basically all the German treatises on the use of the longsword that we have, the longsword was clearly a popular weapon amongst the burghers, amongst the townspeople who adopted it as their favourite fencing sword, pretty much. Of sword and buckler, messer, longsword, all the different types of swords available at the time, and styles, longsword seems to have been perhaps the most popular in 15th century, mid to late 15th century Germany. You can't categorically state that it's the knightly sword or it's the German sword, or in fact it was popular in different countries amongst different people at different times. But the overall point I want to make about it is that the longsword, so this is the first point, and I mentioned there's a second point, but I'll mention that at the end. The overall point I want to make is that at no point, I don't believe, at no point during the Middle Ages in any area was this the most common type of sword to be found. By that, I mean that predominantly the most common swords to find around were still one-handed swords. I think that if you went to 15th century Germany and travelled around for a month, the majority of swords that you would see, probably 70% of swords that you would see, would be one-handed swords of various kinds, and a lot of them, perhaps even the majority, may have been the Langmesser, the long knife. But a lot would have been arming swords as well. And I think that at any point, arming swords would have been more frequently found in society across the board, from top of the kind of food chain down to the bottom, than longswords were. Longswords seem to have been particularly favoured by specific people at specific times in specific places, but they don't ever seem to have outnumbered arming swords or langmessers or whatever. It's also, and this is the second point, because I'm not going to go on for too long about that point, because it's fairly simple, I think. And I fully expect some people are going to disagree with me on this, and some people will go, I think you're wrong, Matt. I think if you went to Germany in 1460, you would find that the longsword was as common as the arming sword. Well, you might say that, but I think that people that say that will base that opinion based on fencing treatises. And fencing treatises are polarized. You're looking at the martial context of the world through a very specific lens, through the lens of the fencing treaties. And you know, if we were to only do that, then we would assume that 90% of people in the 17th century were using rapiers, when in fact we know that huge numbers of people in the 17th century were not using rapiers, certainly not in war. They were using various types of backsword and broadsword and hanger and stuff like this. But they're not covered very much in treatises. So I think treatises are polarizing. They tend to show specific weapons used in specific contexts amongst specific groups of people for specific reasons. You know, famously in Germany, you had the fencing guilds, and the fencing guilds really had a hard-on for longswords. But anyway, so leaving that point, the second point I want to make is about longevity of use. And so going back to the original thing I was saying about the fact that, you know, if people watch movies or Game of Thrones or whatever, they might think that long swords were the most popular types of medieval sword. Well, not only do I think that they weren't the most popular type of sword in the medieval period, but in addition to that, they weren't used for terribly long. Now, some people will say, oh, but I have read Ewart Oakeshott's Archaeology of Medieval Weapons, and he says that there's a documented longsword from 1180. Well, indeed, you can find exceptions to the rule, but generally speaking, longswords did not appear in medieval art or on medieval knightly effigies or even surviving examples or whatever. They did not really appear with any frequency or any regularity really until about in art, it's earlier in art than it is on effigies, but in art from about 1290, 1300, 1310. Okay, so either side of 1300. And in fact, they don't seem to be, and that's just in art. So in art, we start to see long swords, or two-handed swords, start to appear at the very end of the 1200s and beginning of the 1300s. But they don't become common, they don't start to appear commonly in art until almost 100 years later than that, until about 1360, 1370, when full plate harness was coming around. Whether those 2 points are connected or not is irrelevant. Just talking about dates here. So if we look at art, then we start to see long swords appear with some regularity in the late 14th century. And you could say by and large that they appear to be a weapon that really had their heyday, they were really, however popular they were compared to other swords, long swords relative to themselves seem to have been at their height from about 1360 through to about 1520. Okay, that's a relatively short period of time. Yeah, we're talking about, what is that, 160 years. Okay, so really within the context of the Middle Ages, if we go back and we remember, the Middle Ages potentially covers the migration era, so the kind of 6th, 7th century, right the way through to the late 15th century. Okay, so we're talking about centuries. We're almost talking about a millennium. Okay, even if we're conservative, we say we're talking about 800 years for the Middle Ages, really. What most people would call the Middle Ages, about 900 years. And these were only popular, not to say they didn't only exist for this time, but they were only popular for about 160, 180 years of that period. These were not popular for a long time. And it's interesting to note as well that in a way, rapiers were only popular for a similar-ish sort of amount of time as well. So, you know, fashions changed, contexts changed, clothes, armour, warfare, everything changed. And for whatever combination of reasons, these swords were only really to be found with any frequency for about 150 to 180 years. And I would assert that even during that period, these were still not as common as arming swords and langmessers and other types of one-handed sword were. Anyway, I hope that gives you something to think about, and I hope many of you will know these things anyway. Some of you will disagree with what I've said, but for those of you who don't fit into one of the aforementioned categories, maybe this will make you look at the longsword in a slightly different way now. It is a bit like a rapier. It is very much a weapon of its time and place, and it's not something that spans the whole medieval period. And when you see a movie where a crusader in the 12th century, like Kingdom of Heaven, is using a longsword, that's basically wrong. When you see a movie where lots of people are using longswords in, like Braveheart, for example, that's basically wrong. Almost plausible, but basically wrong. When you see a movie about King Arthur and people are using longswords, that is totally freaking wrong. So anyway, I hope that gives you some more accuracy to the context of when we're looking at movies or TV or anything where a longsword is featured. These were specialist swords that were popular for a similar amount of time to the rapier, but earlier than the rapier, of course. Cheers, folks. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe and feel free to follow us on Facebook.